So, Linda, growing up in a sundown town, you mentioned that you never heard anyone talk about it, and therefore you didn't know about it until someone outside of your community or state, somebody with reason to have to look these things up to protect her family. Let you know about this. Let's talk about that silence. Let's talk about the lack of education in our public schools. Tell us a little bit about, your school, your church, your community at large, and looking back, what do you think kept people silent, and why?
Yeah. I mean, I think I went to a pretty average school. I went to a public school. And I think I went to a pretty average church. I grew up evangelical. Our church was, I would say, sort of like mid-sized. And then, eventually when I was in college, became much bigger, became a mega church. Evangelicalism is the largest religious group in this country. So in many ways, between my Midwesternness and my public school and my church and so on and so forth, I feel like I had a very average Jane upbringing.
American education.
Yeah. And I remember learning about slavery as a piece of history and learning about the Trail of Tears as a piece of history. And that's where it ended. And the idea that these things would have continued on in new and different ways and would still be a part of the world today was definitely never mentioned. It's interesting because my husband, as an African-American man, I know received sort of a whole second education that was with his family. He talks a lot about how his family together sat down as a family and watched Eyes on the Prize, right? A video series that we now have as a family on VHS. Which I don't know why we still have so many VHS tapes, but
people, can you talk a little about what Eyes on the Prize is?
Yeah, here, I'll bring it. Just a second. Give me 2 seconds. So it's a PBS special. You can see the VHS.
Thank God for PBS, right?
Yeah, it's a PBS special, America's Civil Rights Years. So essentially a whole other education for those who were not educated about civil rights. Or he talks about his family watching Roots, which we actually did watch a half-an-hour excerpt of Roots when I was in school as part of our module on slavery. But, he and his parents and his brother spent huge amounts of his childhood supplementing the education. They understood that the education that they were receiving in the public schools was an education from a white point of view that prioritized particular eras and particular heroes and omitted huge pieces of history that I think we have a lot of shame about because we know in many ways that they aren't only history, that they are still with us today. And so that's, I think, how he learned so very, very much of what he learned growing up, whereas I have had to do a lot of catch up in my adult years.
Well, in so many of our textbooks, research has proven out that so many of our textbooks in public schools teach a revisionist history.
Yeah.
And obviously from a white lens and point of view, primarily white male, patriarchal lens. And, so they're leaving out a lot of reality that occurred. What, has your husband ever talked about mentally, emotionally, spiritually, how that having to get that secondary education, and coming to realize what the situation he was in as a young Black man, how that felt for him and what it did for him. Because, I really want to juxtapose this against this blissful ignorance of white
Yes.
privilege that you grow up with, thinking, oh, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to go to college and I'm going to get a job and I'm going to have, whatever, and the sky's the limit. And, and you're just raised in this bubble. And then, young African American children are raised having to deal with this very heavy burden of what they're going to have to deal with in their future.
Yeah, your sort of point around it being a juxtaposition is a good one. He didn't need an education about what the situation was today. His family talked about the history to help him to contend with and to understand what he was experiencing today.
Mm-hmm.
At risk of telling too much of my husband's story, I'll tell you a little bit about him. He grew up in an African-American community and was then moved in young boyhood to an almost entirely white community, where they had a school that was a really top-notch public school, had lots of good funding in that community. So he experienced a lot of racism as a boy. His family had a cross burning in their lawn when they moved there. We're not talking about, bygone eras.
And we're talking about 20 years ago.
Maybe a little more than that, but
Yeah.
but yeah, we're not talking about, this doesn't just live in textbooks. This lives in memories of young people. He went to school and was called the N-word, right? He didn't have to be educated about race and racism. He needed to be educated about why is this happening? Why am I being treated this way? And that's, I think, something that really is quite different from what I grew up with. Anything that I have learned about race or racism or my part in it as a white person, or put another way, my white privilege, has been something that I have elected to do, that I have not been forced to do by fact of living in the world. And I know some white people feel very frustrated right now because they don't want to elect to. Right. And now as a culture, we're talking about race more often, and they're like, why do I have to?
Right.
Right. And so increasingly, I think that it is becoming more of a cultural conversation that more and more of us are being invited into, and it is hard to have, which is why I think so many people resist it. But how hard it is for a white person to have that conversation is nothing in comparison to how hard it was for my husband, that little boy, to understand what was going on in his lived experience, why he was getting beat up all the time, right? Why he was being treated that way.
And that's why it's so offensive when white people call it reverse racism. When they refuse to engage the conversation which, as Christians are supposed to do, to put themselves into other people's shoes in order to be able to fully love their neighbor and to fully honor their God and their religious commitment. This stark refusal, to engage in that and to understand how difficult it was and to admit that instead of deny it.
It's hard. It's hard work. I mean, think about how hard it is when, you have an argument with your partner, and your partner reveals something that you realize deep down is true, and that you feel ashamed about. Think about how hard we'll kick and scream and blame and accuse, to avoid having to look at that thing. But sometimes we have to step out and we have to take a walk and we have to let ourselves cool and not spout out a bunch of stuff into our partner, but instead take some space, and do
That's
some
a really
breathing.
good analogy.
Yeah, and do some breathing and say to ourselves, whoa, this might be true about me.
Right. White
So,
people, it's time to be a better partner. It's time to be a better spouse.
yeah. It's
A
hard
better
though. It's hard.
girlfriend,
I mean, it's hard
boyfriend.
in a two-person relationship.
Right.
Imagine how hard it is when we're talking about the world. It's hard when it's a pattern that you've picked up, like not doing the dishes.
Right.
Imagine if it's a pattern that you picked up from your very, very childhood and that you were as blind to as, as can be for your entire life. This is hard work, right? And I just want to champion folks out there who are starting these journeys, because it's really important. And I know that this is why, Jennifer, you wanted to do this video series, because it's important for white people to do this together. Like I said, when maybe don't yell at your partner and accuse and, try to, through shaming, get the shame away from you,
Right.
instead take a step out.
Right.
Maybe you want to call a friend,
Yeah.
or, call your therapist, what I'm trying to say is call your fellow white people and have these conversations, together, so that we don't have to put Black and brown people through the mud again,
Right.
so they don't have to be dragged through the mud again to help you to understand and to
And it's
help you
not their
process your
job to help
pain.
us understand. It's
Yeah.
really not, it shouldn't be a burden on their shoulders, and it has been, because they've been the ones who have had to sacrifice, lose their lives, and so many more things in order to have any progress in our country. And I want to thank you, because that's exactly what Honest White People is about. It's a way to say, look, I think so many white people have a hard time engaging this conversation and learning and coming into a place of reality and understanding and awareness because of the shame. And my goal is to say, it's okay. It's okay if you are taking step one out of the epicenter of racism and ignorance and not knowing. And that's why we're talking about all the things we didn't know, all the times we were ignorant, to say it's okay. And that's where you start.